Welcome to the NTU Raymond Song Chair Professorship of Distinguished Research Lecture Series under the Taiwan Bridges program. It is our honor to invite Professor Eric Maskin as our speaker today. Professor Eric Maskin was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Science in 2007 and will later be sharing his experience with us. 各位长官、各位贵宾，今天宋公元先生顶尖研究讲座台湾桥梁计划诺贝尔奖得主演讲系列即将开始。本场演讲非常荣幸邀请到 Eric Maskin 教授来到台大担任讲者。Eric Maskin 教授在2007年获得诺贝尔经济奖，稍后会和我们分享他的研究经验。First, please join me in welcoming the host today, Professor Wen-Chang, President of National Taiwan University, for his remarks. 在那之前，让我们首先邀请今天的主持人，国立台湾大学陈文章校长致辞。
Thank you. Nobel Laureate Professor Eric Maskin and IPF Chair Dr. Morowitz and also Vice President from Academia Sinica, Vice President Japan, and Vice President and Dean and faculty, student, and also the guests. Good afternoon. On behalf of National Taiwan University, I'd like to welcome Nobel Laureate Professor Eric Maskin from Harvard University to deliver the lectures, the Raymond Song of Distinguished Lecturers at National Taiwan University. And it is also the part of the Taiwan Bridge program that we have enjoyed the lecture series very much. Every lecture we have a lot of attendance and the question and answer is quite active. So I believe today we will enjoy the lecture from Professor Maskin. In particular, his that his contribution is very significant in the case of mechanism design theory, and in particular in the case of the game theory and the incentive and contract theory. I think a lot of our scholar, professor, and student, they are interested in that. Even me, I'm interested in that too. Yeah. So I did study economics when I was an undergraduate student. So anyway, I hope that everyone can get the background more on Professor Maskin. So I will have the Dean of Political Science and Economics in my university, Dean Spiros Maniatis, to introduce Professor Maskin. Thank you.
谢谢陈校长的致辞。Please join me in welcoming Dean Spiros Maniatis from National Taiwan University for a few words. 接着欢迎台大国际政经学院院长 Spiros Maniatis 致辞。
Thank you so much, President Chen, Professor Maskin, respected colleagues, distinguished guests and students, good afternoon. First and foremost, I thought I had a loud voice. First and foremost, on behalf of National Taiwan University, I would like to extend a sincere and warm welcome to all of you for taking the time to join us for this second event of the NTU Raymond Song Chair Professorship of Distinguished Research Lecture Series. I want to express our deep gratitude to Mr. Raymond Song, founder of the Light-On Group, for his generous donation and continued support in establishing this lecture series since 2023. This initiative provides the invaluable opportunity for our NTU faculty and students to engage and interact with Nobel Prize winners across various disciplines throughout 2025 and 2026. This lecture series is also a key component of the Taiwan Bridges program, which is executed in partnership between the International Peace Foundation and Taiwan's academic and research institutions. The foundation firmly believes that education is the basis for peace, and it is dedicated to fostering long-term cooperation between Nobel laureates and academic institutions around the world. I would like to specifically thank the chairman, Mr. Uwe Morovich, for his outstanding efforts. In our first lecture last month, we had the honor of hosting the 2010 Nobel laureate in physics, Professor Sir Andre Geim. Today, we're privileged to welcome and listen to the 2007 Nobel laureate in economic sciences, Professor Eric Maskin. Professor Maskin is currently the Adams University professor at Harvard University, holding professorships in both the Department of Economics and the Department of Mathematics. He earned his bachelor's and doctoral degrees in mathematics from Harvard and served as a postdoctoral fellow at Jesus College, University of Cambridge. He's a respected fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Royal Society. In 2007, Professor Maskin, along with Leonid Horvitz and Roger Myerson, was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for their pioneering work on mechanism design theory. His research spans game theory, contract theory, social choice theory, political economy, and income distribution. And his findings have profoundly impacted modern economic theory and policy design. Today, Professor Maskin will deliver a lecture titled Why Globalization Has Failed to Reduce Inequality, where he will explore the complex relationship between globalization and inequality. This is a phenomenon that puzzles most of us. Why hasn't this seemingly meaningful effort of international cooperation made the world more just and better for all? Professor Maskin has a long-standing commitment to examining how institutions and policies can promote more inclusive societies and fairer development. This is a topic of significant concern to all of us here today. We're extremely excited to hear Professor Maskin's insights and look forward to the discussion session afterwards. So without further ado, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Eric Maskin. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Spiros Maniatis, for the remarks. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Nobel Laureate in Economics, Professor Eric Maskin. 各位贵宾，现在请掌声欢迎诺贝尔奖经济奖得主 Professor Eric Maskin.
Very good. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be back at National Taiwan University. I've been here several times before, and I hope to be here many times in the future as well. Thank you. Thank you. As you've heard, I'm planning to talk about the connection between globalization and inequality today. I don't think I have to explain my claim that globalization has enormously increased over the last 20 or 30 years. And by globalization, I mean that the trade across international boundaries in goods and services has increased enormously. But also, and this is a point that I will be stressing toward the end of my talk, globalization has meant that the very process of production has been internationalized, so that many of the goods we see are not just the product of one country, they are the product of efforts in many countries, and that will turn out to be important. Now, why has globalization occurred? Well, there are several factors involved. First, it's much cheaper today than it was, say, 50 years ago to transport goods around the world. But maybe even more important than that, there has been a decline in communication costs. It's now practically costless to communicate with someone on the other side of the world through the internet, and that has facilitated trade. And also important is that trade barriers in the form of tariffs, at least for many years, declined. We're seeing a resurgence, I find this very unfortunate, a resurgence in tariffs under the current American administration. Let's hope that that's temporary and will not be a permanent feature on the global scene. Now, globalization has made many promises to the world. It has held out the promise that prosperity would come to emerging countries and actually to rich countries as well. And in that case, I think the promise has very clearly been kept. You have only to look at China and India, which have had enormous growth rates over the last decades, and that's mostly because of globalization, the fact that they can trade with countries around the world. Taiwan, too. Taiwan is a rich country, but Taiwan has also benefited from globalization. The fact that the whole world wants its semiconductors has been a boon to the Taiwanese economy. But globalization has made another promise which has not been delivered on, and that was to decrease inequality, to decrease the gap between the haves and the have-nots, especially in poorer countries, emerging economies. In fact, we've seen just the opposite. The income gap in China is bigger than ever. The income gap in India is bigger than ever. The income gap in Brazil is smaller than it was a few years ago, but it's still pretty big. So that is going to be the topic that I want to concentrate on today. Why has inequality increased in emerging economies due to globalization? Inequality, of course, is a topic of interest around the world. Inequality has increased in the United States as well, my own country, and actually it was that increase in inequality which contributed in an important way to the election of Donald Trump. He exploited the fact that people were dissatisfied by inequality. Sad to say, he didn't provide any solutions to that problem, but he got elected promising to do something about it. I really don't want to spend too much time, though, on inequality in rich countries today. I want to concentrate on poor countries, because as you will see, the increase in inequality there is more puzzling from an economic point of view. Now, why is inequality such an important issue? Why does it make such a big difference? I think there are three reasons why most people have some interest in the subject of inequality. First, there's a moral argument, an egalitarian argument, the idea that we are all human beings all deserve the same rights, and if there are vast inequities between incomes and wealth within a country, that offends our moral sensibilities. But even if you don't accept that argument, there's the idea that by decreasing inequality, we can help to eradicate poverty. If in China, for example, we can elevate hundreds of millions of people out of destitution, that's very good for ending poverty, and at the same time, it helps reduce income inequality in China. Now, it actually turns out to be more complicated than that for reasons that I will be coming to. And then finally, even if you don't care about egalitarianism or poverty per se, simply as a practical matter, reducing inequality improves political stability. Countries which have radically wide income distributions, and income distributions that are getting more unequal tend to be less politically stable. So just for holding together the social fabric, reducing inequality can be a useful tool. So now I come to the central question. Should we be surprised that inequality in emerging economies has been going up due to globalization? And interestingly, the answer from an economist standpoint is yes, because it contradicts a very important and very successful idea in economics, which is called the theory of comparative advantage, which is a principle that goes back over 200 years. It was first developed in its fullness by the British economist David Ricardo, and it's, as I say, it's been very successful for 200 years in predicting international trade patterns. And because it's so important, and because it predicts that free trade should reduce inequality in emerging economies, I would like to spend some time now explaining why the theory of comparative advantage makes that prediction. It turns out to be a wrong prediction when it comes to the recent globalization, but it was a correct prediction for previous periods of globalization. So I'm going to review very briefly the theory of comparative advantage. The theory of comparative advantage is based on the idea that the reason why different countries trade with one another is because these countries have different endowments in the factors of production. So, for example, a country like Taiwan, which doesn't have much by way of natural resources, has a great endowment of high-skilled people. And the reason why Taiwan is so successful is because of its high-skilled people. And so naturally, when Taiwan trades, it trades goods which use those skills intensely, such as semiconductors. So I'm going to simplify matters for purposes of discussion and assume that there are two factors of production, two inputs into production, and only two. There's high-skilled labor, people with a lot of skills, and there's low-skilled labor, people without much skills. And let's suppose that there are just two countries, again, to make things as simple as possible. There's a rich country and there's an emerging country, an emerging economy. And the reason why the rich country is rich is because it has a high ratio of high-skilled labor to low-skilled labor. The reason why the emerging economy is poor is that just the opposite is true. But because the rich country has such a high proportion of high-skilled labor, it has a comparative advantage in producing goods that require high skills. So computer software is an example of such a good. And I'm going to use software as my standard example. The emerging economy has a low ratio of high skill to low skill, so it has a comparative advantage producing goods where skill doesn't matter so much, and these are often agricultural goods, such as rice. Now, we're interested in how globalization affects production and how it affects inequality. So in order to understand that effect, we're going to do the following thought experiment. We'll look at production patterns and inequality before globalization becomes possible. So we'll start from a position where there's no trade between the rich country and the poor country. And then we'll look at production after international trade becomes possible. And we'll compare the two. And the difference between those two is the effect of globalization on production and on inequality. Okay, so let's start with a case where the two countries cannot trade with one another. We're looking at a simple world where there are just two goods. There's software and there's rice. Since the rich country can't get any goods from the poor country, it has to produce all the goods itself. So it produces software and it produces rice because consumers in the rich country want both software and rice. And same thing in the emerging economy. They want software and rice, and so companies in the emerging economy produce software and rice. But there's a sense in which producing computer software in the emerging economy is inefficient. It's making inefficient use of the labor force. The labor force is better suited for rice. So to the extent that production is being diverted away from rice to software, that's going to be bad for low-skilled workers because they're not much needed for software. They are needed a lot for rice. And so if the country is producing all this software, that's not good for low-skilled workers. And that means that low-skilled workers, before trade between the rich country and the poor country becomes possible, will be fairly low. The demand for low-skilled labor will be low, and therefore the low-skill wage will be low. And just the opposite is true for the high-skilled workers in the emerging economy. They are very much in demand for software production. They will benefit from this software production, and their wages will be high. So far I've talked about the pre-globalization case, the case where the two countries cannot trade. But now let's suppose that the door between the two countries opens and there can be free trade. What will happen? Well, now the rich country no longer has to produce its own rice. It can shift production away from rice to software and import the rice from the emerging economy. And that makes more sense from the rich country's point of view because it, as I said, it has a comparative advantage in producing software, so it should concentrate on software. In the emerging economy, we'll see just the opposite. We'll see a shift in production away from software to rice, and the software will be imported from the rich country. So that's how production will change as a result of globalization. How will inequality change? Well, because the emerging economy is now producing more rice and less software than before, the demand for low-skilled workers will be higher than before. They're needed for rice, they're not needed for software. So the demand for low-skilled workers will rise. The demand for high-skilled workers will decline. So the low-skilled wages will increase, the high-skilled wages will decrease, and inequality will be lower than before. So what I've now explained is why the standard prediction of the theory of comparative advantage is that globalization will decrease inequality in emerging economies. And in fact, this prediction was completely correct for 200 years until the current globalization. There actually have been quite a few previous periods of globalization. One of them was in the late 19th century, when it became much cheaper to send goods across the Atlantic Ocean. So at that point, the United States had become a major economy. Europe had been a major economy or collection of economies for hundreds of years already. But the trade between the US and Europe increased dramatically toward the end of the 19th century. At that time, Europe had a relative abundance of low-skill labor. The US had a relative abundance of high-skill labor. And just as the theory of comparative advantage predicted, when trade between the US and Europe increased, inequality fell in Europe. This is a well-established fact about the late 19th century globalization. But unfortunately, the theory of comparative advantage has been less successful for the current globalization. I'm going to ignore the first prediction on that slide. I want to concentrate on the second prediction, which is the one that we've already seen, that globalization should decrease inequality in emerging economies. That prediction has simply not come true. So the fact that comparative advantage theory was not working well inspired Michael Kremer and me. Michael Kremer is a well-known development economist. In fact, he won the Nobel Prize for that a few years ago. But even before he was recognized by the Nobel, he and I worked on an alternative theory to the theory of comparative advantage. And that's what I want to show you today. So what is different about the current globalization from previous periods of globalization? Why is now different from the late 19th century when it comes to globalization? And what we want to suggest is the difference is that now we see the internationalization of the production process itself. Think of computers. A computer is the product of an international collaboration. The computer might be designed in the US, it might be programmed in Europe, the chips probably come from Taiwan, and then the computer itself is assembled in China. So many countries are involved, and computers are just one example out of thousands where an international collaboration is required. So that's an important ingredient of our alternative theory. And another important ingredient is that now we're going to expand from just two possible skill levels to many possible skill levels. In fact, for the talk I'm giving today, I'm going to suppose that there are 4 skill levels. We need more than 2 to make this story work. But other than those two changes, I'm going to stick with the same kind of thought experiment that I did a few minutes ago for the theory of comparative advantage. That is, I'm going to continue to assume that there are just two countries, a rich country, a poor country, and I'm going to assume that the rich country is rich because it has workers of higher skills. Let's call the skill levels A, B, C, and D, where A and B are the higher skills, and C and D are the lower skills. So the rich country is rich in A and B workers. The emerging country has mostly workers of skill level C and D. So A is bigger than B is bigger than C is bigger than D. Actually, everything I say would still work even if C were bigger than B. So that's not essential to the argument. And this is a story which is going to concentrate on production. As I said, the one key element of this theory is that it's been the internationalization of the production process which explains the increase in inequality. So imagine that if you're producing a good, like a computer, different tasks have to be performed. And again, to simplify matters, we'll assume that there are just two tasks. There's a managerial task, which is sensitive to skill. You want managers to be highly skilled people. And there's a subordinate task, which is less sensitive to skill. So it might suffice to have a lower skilled person in the subordinate role. And we'll imagine that you get output by matching people together in these two tasks. You put someone in the managerial task, you put someone in the subordinate task, and then you get a corresponding amount of output. The amount of output you get will depend on the skill levels of the people performing the tasks. So the higher the skill, the more output you get. And this is I promise you, this is the only mathematical formula in the whole talk. It's output equals m squared times s. Now, what does that mean? M is the skill level of the manager. And we'll suppose that this is just a number. Higher numbers mean higher skill. And S is the skill level of the subordinate. So the fact that this is m squared S simply means that output is more sensitive to the manager's skill than to the subordinate skill. That's the only significance of this square here. So for example, just to illustrate this formula, if the manager's skill level is 4 and the subordinate skill level is 3, then this formula gives you m squared, 4 times 4, times 3, or 48. And everything is going to turn on how different workers are matched with one another. You would expect that in a functional economy, an economy which works well, the matching will be done so as to maximize the output. So let's illustrate that point, let's suppose that there are let's look at a very small labor force. It just consists of 4 workers. There are 2 workers of skill level 3, and there are 2 workers of skill level 4. Well, there are 2 ways that those 4 workers could be matched. We could match a 4 with a 3 and the other 4 with the other 3. This is what I'll call cross-matching. It's called cross-matching because we have workers of different skills occupying the different tasks. Or we could have what I'll call homogeneous matching, where we have a 3-worker matched with the other 3-worker and a 4-worker matched with the other 4-worker. Well, if you calculate the output for these 2 different matches, you'll see that it's higher for cross-matching in this example. And so we would expect that if we had a labor force consisting of 2 3-workers and 2 4-workers, we would get cross-matching, not homogeneous matching, because we would get more output with the cross-matching. But that depends on this being the labor force. Suppose we had a different labor force, still with just 4 workers, but there are 2 workers and there are 2 4-workers. So it's the same as the previous example, but we've reduced the skill level of 2 of the workers from 3 to 2. Now if you do the calculations, if you compare cross-matching with homogeneous matching, you get higher output with homogeneous matching. You see, there are 2 forces at work in deciding how workers should be matched. On the other hand, so on one hand, because the 2 tasks, the managerial task and the subordinate task, have different sensitivities to skill, that pushes you in the direction of cross-matching, where you have a higher skilled worker in the managerial task and a lower skilled worker in the subordinate task. But if the skill levels are too different, then it's a waste to pair a high-skilled worker with a low-skilled worker. You're losing the great skill advantage of the high-skilled worker. In that case, you want to have homogeneous matching, where you pair a high-skilled worker with another high-skilled worker. And so you see there's a balance between those 2. Whatever we see in practice will be a compromise between these 2 opposite force principles. So let's apply this idea to our 2 countries. And as I said, we're going to do the same thought experiment we did when we talked about the theory of comparative advantage, but we're now going to apply it to this alternative theory. So we have the 2 countries. The rich country has A and B workers. The poor country has C and D workers. I'm going to suppose that I'm going to plug in some particular numbers, but actually the analysis that I'm going to go through would work for a very wide range of numbers. We want to look first at what happens before globalization. Before globalization, you cannot match workers from different countries together. That's what I mean by international production, where you have, say, a manager in one country and subordinates in another country. You can't do that in the pre-globalization days. All of the production has to go on domestically. So what would we expect before international production becomes possible? We'd expect a picture like this, where in the rich country, the A workers are matched with the B workers. In the poor country, the C workers are matched with the D workers. But how does that change once international production becomes possible? We get this picture. So the difference is that now, instead of the C workers being matched with the D workers in the poor country, they're matched with the B workers in the rich country. And let's see what the implication of this different matching has on inequality and wages. Well, notice that the C workers used to be stuck with the D workers. The D workers are the least skilled people of all. Now they have this new employment opportunity. They can work for an international company or a company that competes with an international company and get matched with B workers. And that's going to be good for the C workers. Their productivity is enhanced by the fact that they're now working with higher skill people than before. So we would expect that thanks to globalization, C worker wages will rise. But the poor D workers, who used to be matched with C, are now left on their own. Their wages either stay the same or perhaps even fall because they don't have new employment opportunities like the C workers. So they're not better off as a result of globalization. So we expect the C worker wages will rise, the D worker wages will stay the same or fall, and so just as we were expecting, inequality in the emerging economy will actually increase as a result of globalization. Notice this is in sharp contrast to the theory of comparative advantage, the standard theory. So inequality is made worse. And this we would claim is it's a very simple, but I think actually quite empirically compelling explanation for why inequality rose in Brazil and India and so forth as a result of globalization. Now, what do we do about it? One conclusion that you might draw from this is that we should stop globalization. Because after all, globalization increases inequality. Inequality is a bad thing, so maybe we should stop globalization. I think that would be a terrible policy conclusion to draw, because after all, globalization has contributed enormously to the well-being of the world. The world is a much richer place now than it was 30 years ago. And I'm not talking about just the rich countries. The poor countries have got richer too, at least the ones that have been involved in globalization. So the problem is not that globalization is a bad thing. It's not a bad thing, but it has this unfortunate outcome of increasing inequality. So the right answer, I think, is to do something about the inequality, not to try to end globalization, but to do something about the inequality. What should we do? Well, the problem in the poor country, the emerging economy, is that these D workers are left out of the picture. They don't get the new job opportunities that globalization brings. How do we fix that? Well, we do something to try to improve their skill level. We give them education. We give them job training. And that enables them to benefit from globalization also. The problem, of course, is that education and job training don't come for free. Someone has to pay for them. And the workers themselves can't afford to do that. We're talking about these D workers who are some of the poorest people in the world. They're probably subsisting on rudimentary agriculture. They can't afford to go to school. They can't afford to send their children to school. So we can't expect them to pay for it. You might hope that employers, people who hire workers, could give them job training. But notice that they're probably not going to have the incentive to do that. Because if I'm a D worker and you're a company that is thinking of hiring me, yes, you could give me the training so that my skill level would be raised appropriately. But after you do that, I don't have to work for you. I could go to work for your competitor. And then not only will your investment in me have failed to pay off, but you're actually helping the other company. So we shouldn't expect that employers will have sufficient incentive to solve the inequality problem on their own. However, government can do something about this. Governments can create subsidies for companies that are willing to train D workers. By subsidizing the training, the government gives companies the incentive to do the training. Government can also subsidize education, either by offering free education or at least giving grants and scholarships to poor students who wouldn't be able to get that education otherwise. So there is lots of scope for increasing the skill level of D workers, and that, I think, is the optimistic side of the picture that I'm painting here. Yes, globalization leads to inequality, but we can, if we have the political will, do something about that inequality through education and job training. So if the theory I've outlined to you today is correct, and I think by now there is a fair amount of evidence that it is, then the right course of action is not to try to stop globalization, even if that were possible. May at this point not be even realistic. Donald Trump has tried to do that, but hasn't succeeded very much. But we shouldn't be trying to stop globalization. Rather, we should be allowing low-skilled workers, the D workers of the world, to share in the benefits of globalization too. And with that optimistic remark, let me stop and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Eric Maskin, for your informative and inspiring thoughts. We will be entering the Q&A session shortly. Please have a seat as our staff proceed with the venue setup. 谢谢 Professor Eric Maskin 精彩的分享，请先回座。接下来将进行 Q&A 交流，在进行前，我们先请工作同仁布置现场。
You should give the advice to Trump.
He won't listen to me. He won't listen to any
But your
economist.
point is right.
这样这个就可以 work 了嘛？
对，我已经帮你开好了。
所以我现在这样
你们
上去
好比的话了，我们楼上的英文
Not settled down yet, right?
Not
可
yet,
是
no.
直接这样讲。
哦，你们是松掉了吗？
对
等我一下，等我一下。
It's very foolish.
Yeah, I think so too.
Now, I would like to invite our panelist of today, Professor Eric Maskin, the 2007 Nobel Laureate in Economics, Professor Wang Daoyi, Distinguished Professor at the Department of Economics, NTU, and our moderator today, Professor Huang Zhenying, Distinguished Professor at the Department of Economics, NTU, will take the stage for the Q&A session. 我们现在请掌声欢迎 Professor Eric Maskin, 台大经济学系王道一特聘教授与黄真颖特聘教授上台进行问答交流。
So I should get started, and I would like to use this chance to say that let's have fun and let the sincerity flow. And I think the utmost important thing is to ask sincere questions. So if you feel that you, like me, my English is not very good. So if you feel that you feel uncomfortable and you would like to ask in Chinese, we have this almighty Joseph here. He can translate any language into English, including Japanese. So try him, and so let's shoot. So any questions so far for Professor Maskin? Would you like to pick the one that you want to answer?
You should.
Okay, so why don't...
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk, and I have two questions for you. And my first question is, what kind of workers do the workers represent in the reality? And the second question is that, are there any economic benefits or needs to maintain production in low skill level? If not, then why we haven't seen government in different countries putting a lot of effort in promoting the production level for the workers?
Yeah. So those are two very good questions. Thank you. The first question is, I was talking about D workers. Who are these D workers in reality? I think in most countries, D workers are people who work in what I would call subsistence agriculture. That is, they grow enough so that they can survive on what they produce, but they don't produce much more than that. They may sell their produce in local markets, but they're not going to be selling things internationally. They can't compete at the international level. So subsistence agriculture is a good example of a D worker activity. And as for government efforts to promote skill, we actually have seen a fair amount of effort there. To take one example, I mentioned that Brazil has had very high income inequality, and this was an outcome of globalization. But the Brazilian government has taken important steps for reducing inequality by something that's called conditional cash transfers. So think of subsistence agricultural workers in Brazil. For generations, these families have not been able to send their children to school. Why? Because they're needed to produce food. They can't afford to go to school. It's too costly to the family. But the problem is, if they're not going to school, they stay poor. They don't have the skills to get a better life for themselves. So conditional cash transfers are payments by the government to poor families, subsistence agricultural families, on the condition that they send their children to school. So this is good for the family because they get this cash. And it's good for the children because they get to go to school and make a better life for themselves. And it's good for Brazil because it helps to reduce the income inequality in Brazil. So everyone gains from a scheme like this. And this is actually a fairly common tool now in many countries with high inequality. But I would argue that it could be used on an even bigger scale. It really needs to be scaled up to solve the inequality problem once and for all. But very, very good questions.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for the fantastic speech, Professor Maskin. I was wondering for the equation, because I'm a physicist and I am really interested in numbers, and I was wondering, in a typical company, you wouldn't have just one manager managing only the employees underneath them. You would have multiple levels of managing.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, instead of output equals m squared s, could you have m1 squared times m2 to the power of, I don't know, 1.5, times m3 to the power of 1.2, things like that? And in that case, you could have a very skilled manager on the top level impacting even the lowest levels of productivity in the supply chain. And I guess that would also imply an approach of more intensive managerial interactions between different levels, where you would have managers encouraged to interact with levels in proximity of their command level in the company. Thank you.
So a very nice observation. For the purpose of this talk, I simplified matters and supposed that there were only two tasks, but you're absolutely correct that in reality, of course, there are more than two, and that helps break the force against matching people of very different skill levels. I mean, that if there are only two tasks and they have very different skills, it might be extremely inefficient to match them together. But maybe if there are multiple layers, then you can have the very skilled matched together with the very unskilled, and that's correct. However, the more skill levels you have in a given organization, the bigger that organization is going to be. And it may, after a point, it may simply be inefficient from a supervisory point of view to expand still further. There's a reason why there's not just one company for the whole country, why there are companies of different sizes, because after a point, getting still bigger is no longer makes economic sense. So given that there's a constraint on how big and how complicated companies can be, the same principles that I was talking about in the two-task case still apply in the multitask case. But you raise a very valid point.
I'm going to give Joseph an edge. He has a question about inequality to ask.
Okay, so I was wondering, would language being like a bilingual language, being a way to help these D-level workers, because that also helps them to match with some of the foreign workers. This is an important question for Taiwan because we're having this bilingual policy, but a lot of the high school and the middle school teachers complain that this is so useless.
Well, actually, a very good example, I'm glad you raised the example of languages, because for many jobs, that is a crucially important skill. One thing that Americans have got used to is if they call their bank, for example, or if they call for technical assistance, they won't actually get someone in the bank. They won't get an American at all. They'll get someone from a call center in India. And the reason they get the call center in India is because there are people in India who have learned English and now are employable as respondents to questions from Americans about their bank balance or about how to turn their computer on. And those jobs are only possible because of the bilingualism that is encouraged in Indian education. So I'm very much in favor of bilingualism. It raises skill levels.
Okay, so the person in red over there.
Thank you so much for your sharing today. So I have one question regarding your presentation. So you claim that according to the Ricardian model, the inequality, the globalization should reduce inequality, and you found out that after the period of around 1980s, it's not correct anymore. The globalization actually increased the inequality, right?
Right.
So at this time, I also realized during this period, it's also a time that technology is booming and it's very fast growing of technology. So my question here is, how do you separate the growth of technology to the globalization here? I mean, like for example, if we control all variable, we keep let's say globalization not happen, and we still let the technology grow. Do you think this is also a main driver of the inequality?
So again, a very good question. Was technology the major driver of increased inequality? Unquestionably, technology aggravated, made worse the problem of inequality, because technology has, again, favored workers with high skills. High-skilled people can use computers, low-skilled people can't. So high-skilled workers get the benefit of increased productivity from working with these computers. You'll notice that in my presentation today, I didn't mention technology at all. And the reason I didn't mention technology is because fundamentally, it was not technology which explained most of the inequality. It was the internationalization of production that explained the inequality. So I will agree that technology made the problem worse, but it was not the central cause. The central cause, I would argue, was the globalization of production.
Okay, over there. I'm going to favor my student over there.
Thank you, Professor Maskin. It's a very impressive talk. I want to ask the previous question. Is that you mentioned it will be very beneficial if we can scale up the investment on worker D in emerging countries. I want to ask which country is going to pay that money, because what we observe in modern world is that the opportunity of educating worker D is opportunity cost of educating worker D in emerging country is really high. Emerging country themselves cannot afford it. But for rich countries, there are many D workers in rich countries themselves. Rich countries will not allow their government to invest on D workers in emerging countries. So who will going to pay that investment? I'm curious about that. Thank you.
Well, that's a good question. Emerging economies, of course, are poor, but they're not so poor that they can't make investments in their own people. If you think of the many possible investments that a country like India, for example, could make, there is no investment which would pay off more than raising the skill level of their poorest population. And so they should make these investments, and in fairness to them, they do. There has been a significant subsidization of education in India by the government. All I'm saying is that they could be doing even more. And maybe not all of the investment has to come from the government. Maybe it can come from international organizations. The World Bank, for example, has spent millions and millions of dollars on improving education in developing countries, and I expect that it will continue to do this. The UN makes investments in education. There are lots of possible sources, but I think even in a poor country, the primary responsibility for the population in the poor country is the government of that country. They should be shouldering the major burden in investing in their people.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to expose my ignorance. Why in graduate school we don't teach inequality more? I always learn about efficiency, but I learn less about inequality.
So I think if you went back to Harvard, Chen Ying was my student many years ago at Harvard, and I'm very proud of her. But it was many years ago, and I think if you were back at Harvard now, you would see much more on inequality, and because not because Harvard has improved so much, although I think it has improved a bit, but because inequality has become a more central issue in the political and global landscape. So you would definitely see it now.
Maybe I should go back.
Come back anytime.
Okay. So Joseph, you should favor your student. Try.
Okay, so we'll have a student upstairs.
Yeah, upstairs.
Yeah.
The one in the black.
Yeah, the one in black.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. And you mentioned Donald Trump a couple of times during the presentation, and I want to ask a question regarding him. Using the argument of Professor Daniel Roderick, he argues that hyperglobalization has significantly reduced global inequality by lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty in developing countries, but at the cost of sharply increasing within country inequality in advanced economies and eroding democratic policy space. So to what extent do you agree that the political backlash against globalization, like populism, protectionism in wealth nations, is a justifiable response to these domestic costs?
Well, thank you for that question. Danny Roderick happens to be my colleague at Harvard, and he's also a friend. And I agree with him that what he calls hyperglobalization has been a problem, but I would describe the problem somewhat differently from the way he does. The problem with hyperglobalization, by which he means globalization at a very fast pace, has been that our ability to adjust to the changes that it creates has been reduced. That's also true, by the way, for the changes that new technology have brought. Both globalization and automation have caused a lot of people to lose their jobs. Jobs that some Americans were doing 20 years ago are now being done in Mexico or in India or in China. And some of those jobs are now being done by machines. In the long run, the world will benefit from the globalization and the automation. But in the short run, people lose their jobs. Until new jobs are created, they will be worse off. And it's that fact, the fact that these changes have been disruptive, that I think has caused the reaction to globalization and has allowed, for example, Donald Trump to get elected, promising to help people who have been thrown out of work, but then not offering any solution to that problem. My argument is that we shouldn't be stopping the globalization or automation process. Even if it were stoppable, these are such powerful engines of prosperity that we shouldn't stop them, but we do need to do something about the people who have been made worse off as a result of automation and globalization. And so perhaps slowing down the change so that we have a chance to adjust would be a good thing. I'm very fond of historical examples because I think we have a lot to learn from history. Think back to the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th century, early 19th century. This was a time of amazing new technologies that were coming out and revolutionizing the industrial world. Ultimately, this was of great benefit to workers. Real wages in the 19th century in Europe increased faster in those 100 years from 1800 to 1900 than they had increased in the previous 1,000 years. This was owing to new technology. But we forget that those wage increases did not occur right away. What happened right away was that a lot of people lost their jobs. And the wage increases didn't occur until many years later when entrepreneurs finally figured out how to combine the new technology with new kinds of skills for workers. That lesson from the original industrialization, from the original industrialization of the 18th and 19th century should be remembered today when making sure that we take care of people who either lose their jobs or are stuck forever in subsistence agriculture. The historical lessons still apply today. We do need to take an active role in making those people's lives better. It's not going to happen automatically, or it's not going to happen automatically for many, many years. That's why we need governments involved in promoting education, why we need government involved in promoting job training. That's a long answer to your question, but I think it required a long answer.
Go to our colleague over there.
Professor Maskin, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us, and I enjoy your talk very much. In your model, it seems that the labor supplies of the Type C and Type D workers are fixed. But when the economies are open for trade, actually it changes the incentives to invest in education. So I believe that those poor, talented students, like Type D workers, they will be willing to invest in education when the economies are open for trade. So even without any government subsidizing education, they are willing to invest more in education. But the problem that they face is that they are not able to borrow. So I think that the credit market imperfections are also a very important problem in this issue. So what government can do is beyond just the subsidizing education. Maybe they can do more. Maybe they can improve the efficiency in the credit market.
You are absolutely correct. When I said that the D workers couldn't pay for the training themselves or the education themselves, I meant exactly what you're saying, that they would not be able to get a loan to pay for the education they need. At least they could not be able to get a loan unless they got assistance, say from the government. The government guaranteed the loan or something like that. So yes, credit market imperfections are critical to the story of why D workers cannot borrow their way out of poverty. You're right.
I'm very thankful that my mom can finance my higher education.
Yeah.
So people in the back, the student, it seems to be a student, white. Yeah. It's you, you are looking, it's you.
Hi, Professor, and thank you for your inspiring talk regarding the mechanism behind the globalization and inequality. And you have mentioned that the producers lack of incentive to train workers because they might leave for other competitors. But in the globalization war, didn't the domestic government face the same so-called free rider problem? Like in Taiwan, the government keeps the tuition low to build a skilled workforce. But in the scenario of globalization, many of us can easily move to other countries for the better pay. So why does the domestic government still have the incentive to educate us if they risk losing us to the global market?
That's a very good question. And in fact, what some countries do in order to hold on to their well-trained workers is to insist that if they help pay for a person's education, perhaps they even are willing to pay to send that person abroad to a foreign university. In return, the person has to promise to come back at least for a period of time. This is a very common arrangement where yes, you get a government scholarship and you can take it anywhere you want in the world, but then you have to come back for 2 years or 5 years, some period of time to, in effect, repay the debt that you've incurred. Otherwise, you're quite correct. There is a free rider problem, and governments might be reluctant to train their own people.
Second floor.
Thank you, Prof, for your presentation. In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned about the policymakers in this inequality, and even you mentioned about your country in US. And my specific question is that if, for example, if your president is in front of you, what is the golden piece of your advice to him to reduce this inequality?
What would I recommend to Donald Trump? If only he would listen. The problem is that he's been getting terrible economic advice. And he's certainly not listening to me. But if he did, I think I'd recommend two things in particular. First, get rid of the ridiculous tariffs. We should have learned through hundreds of years of painful experience with tariffs that they are a bad idea. If I want to trade with you, if you and I are talking about making a trade, it's presumably because if we make the trade, we're both going to benefit. But a tariff is a tax on trade. If I have to pay something to trade with you and you have to pay something to trade with me, we're less likely to make that trade, and therefore we're less likely to mutually improve ourselves. So by that very simple logic, you can see that tariffs are not a good force for promoting prosperity. So I would recommend to Trump that he get rid of the ludicrous tariffs that he's imposed. But the second thing I would do is that he should live up to his promise to help the people who have been thrown out of work because of globalization or thrown out of work because of automation. Those are the people who elected him, and he hasn't done anything for them. Ironically, his predecessor, Joe Biden, the previous president, did do a lot. Biden had the government invest a lot of money in what we call community colleges. These are not the same as universities. They are local institutions which give people training for jobs that are actually highly in demand. And so they're a great way of getting people employed in jobs which pay a reasonable wage. Biden invested hundreds of millions of dollars, but the problem is that those investments do not get realized until years later. If you subsidize my education so that I can learn how to be an electrician, for example. Electricians, by the way, are very much in demand in the US. I'm not going to be working as an electrician for some years. So the payoff to the investment is not immediate. And one problem with Trump is that he's unwilling to do anything which doesn't give him a return right away. So we're sacrificing any kind of long-term investment for short-term showmanship. That's what Trump is about. He's about showmanship rather than about real real accomplishments. There are many other things I could say to Donald Trump as well, but I think those are the two things that I would start with.
How can we make a politician having longer foresight than looking more forward?
That's a very good question, and it's not an easy one to answer, but I think once again education is part of the answer. So take a problem like climate change. Climate change is for the most part a very long-term problem. The major effects of climate change are not actually going to be felt for many years. And so you might think, well, with politicians interested only in the next election, this will never get done. However, thanks to education, more people than ever understand the problems of climate change, and a well-informed electorate will demand solutions to these long-term problems. So ultimately, we only get politicians of the quality that we deserve because we elect them. If the public is better informed, and education there is the key, I think there's reason to believe they will elect better politicians.
Okay. Yixuan.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
I'm thinking if the heterogeneity in skill levels within each country is also a reason for international production. So in your example, suppose we, through education, we reduce the gap between type C and type D workers in the emerging country. Mm-hmm. After that, is it possible that the international company finds international production less attractive? They don't want to hire workers from emerging country anymore, probably because those type D workers becomes more expensive, for example. And in this sense, is it possible that although we might still reduce the inequality in the emerging country, how can we be sure that the country overall can still become wealthier? Is it possible that the overall wealth level also decreases after we try to reduce this heterogeneity in skill levels?
So that's an interesting question. In fact, in the model I showed you, increasing skill levels is always a good thing for a country. They will always be able to produce more as a result of increasing skill levels. And increasing skill levels will also make workers more attractive to companies based abroad. It's true that they are going to have to pay them more, but they will also be getting higher productivity. So again, you can show in this model that C and D workers both become more attractive as their as their skill levels go up. Now, it's too much to expect any country to eliminate inequality altogether. That you can do in a simple model, but you're never going to be able to do that in practice. Nevertheless, by concentrating investments on the low-skill workers, you can reduce inequality, and any such investment is going to move things in the right direction, at least in models related to the one I talked about. You could probably dream up some other model where that doesn't happen, but the point I want to make in favor of the model I showed you today is that it seems to fit the facts of globalization as we know them. It does a pretty good job of putting everything together.
Hi, thank you so much for this lecture. It is very inspiring. So I would like to go back a little bit to earlier questions about politicians, like incentive of the politicians in lowering inequality. We have talked a lot about the US, right? But I think the incentives for politicians to actually perpetuating inequality is more pronounced in emerging economies to maintain their legacies in politicians. And although it is risky for maintaining inequality among the poor of the poor, but as long as the median voters still supports that those politicians in maintaining inequalities or only doing policies for short-term winnings, I personally think that programs like retraining might not be as supportive as other alternatives. So how would you explain this situation, or how would you suggest an alternatives to cope with these situations in emerging economies?
So thank you for that question. You make a good point, which is just because an emerging economy could do something about inequality, it might not, because the median voter in that country might not be a D worker, might be someone of higher skill, or at least of high enough skill so that they would not be receiving most of the benefits of this investment. That's absolutely right. And that suggests that, and this came up in a previous question, that suggests that we're never going to see inequality eliminated altogether, even if it were theoretically possible. But let me come back to something I said toward the beginning of my talk, which is that one motivation for trying to do something about inequality is political stability. As the political leader of a country, I might be motivated to improve the lives of, say, subsistence farmers not because they're my main constituents, but because I'm worried that there's going to be too much social unrest if I don't do something about the inequality. Take a country like China. China doesn't even have elections, but the government still cares about inequality because it cares about the possibility of social mobilization. So even authoritarian governments do have incentives to do something about inequality, maybe not to cure it altogether, but to move things in the right direction. And that was, that I think is the main takeaway from my talk today, not that you could ever get rid of inequality completely, but that there are things that can be done that will effectively attack it, even if the government is not listening, especially to e-workers. Very, very good point you raise.
We have too many questions, so maybe the principal should reserve another trip for Professor Maskin to come back very quickly. So I think we can still take like one more question.
Okay.
So, Ethan.
Thank you. Taiwan actually benefit from international trade. Like in the last 49 years, we always have a trade surplus over the years. So we accumulate those wealth and investment in education. So in my generation, which is 1990s, I think in my generation, we have less than 50% that we can get into the college. But now, in the last 2 decades, it is fair to say that our young people have 100% to get into the college. I think everyone can agree about this, observation. But however, we still have inequality problem. So according to your suggestions that government should investment in education, which is done in Taiwan, and we have 100%. So by your definition, maybe we can say that all workers become C workers in Taiwan. But my question is that in some area like semiconductor, our workers now maybe they become, some of them become B workers or even A workers in some special cases like TSMC. I think they are the world leaders as A workers in Taiwan. So in this case, it might violate your basic assumption, but which is what we observe in Taiwan. So I'm not sure that how to solve this problem because we invest in education actually, but we still have inequality problem. That is my question. Thank you.
So I'm not, I think it would be presumptuous of me in talking to an audience of people who know more about the economy of Taiwan than I do, to explain inequality in Taiwan. But let me talk about inequality in the U.S. U.S. like Taiwan is a pretty rich country, and yet it has a problem with inequality. And in the U.S., it's not that some people get to go to school and others don't. Everyone goes to school. But some people acquire skills that are in demand, and others don't. And it's the ones without skills, the people without skills, who are the resentful ones. Maybe they had jobs before and they lost them, or maybe they weren't able to get a job in the first place. So the answer to that problem is not education per se, because as I said, everyone is educated, but rather education in skills that are actually in demand. And I was applauding our previous president, Joe Biden, for taking an important step in that direction by allocating money to community colleges where people do learn skills that are in demand now, but where the payoff is not immediate. It comes with a lag of at least a few years. For all I know, community colleges might be the solution to Taiwan's inequality problem too, but I'm not expert enough in inequality here to say that with much confidence. So I'm very willing to say it about the US. Perhaps that lesson translates into Taiwan.
We have to conclude here.
Okay.
So thank you very much for the very sincere and thoughtful, insightful exchange. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Eric Maskin, Professor Wang, and Professor Huang for the wonderful discussion. Professor Maskin, please remain on stage. 谢谢三位精彩的问答交流 Professor Eric